Hello, 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 everybody. Hey, it's Dr. Mitzi Joy. I am running a few minutes late. I was having some technical difficulties, but I am here now and ready to live stream and talk to you a little bit about my great meeting in Berlin a couple of weeks ago. I'm taking a little break from studying, so for those of you that have been following, you know I'm studying for my boards. I'm going to take a little break and talk a little bit about some of the stuff I presented. Tonight's music is via Coldplay, one of my favorite groups. Every Teardrop is a Waterfall. It just makes you want to kind of move, right? I love Coldplay. So, Every Teardrop is a Waterfall, one of my favorite songs. It is on my morning motivation playlist, so when I get ready in the morning and I need something to kind of give me a little pep in my step, this is on my list. All right, good stuff. So we are gonna fade Coldplay down. All right, very cool. All right, so again, I'm Dr. Mitzi Joy. I am a board certified neurologist and multiple sclerosis specialist, and my mission is to engage, educate, and empower people living with MS to become an active part of their healthcare team. And I also want to encourage people to become involved in clinical research and discuss the importance of clinical research, which is really a passion of mine. So, again, I'm taking a little study break to come talk to you guys. I didn't want to be gone too long, and I've been gone for 2 weeks. I was at ECTRIMS, and then last week I had some things going on, so I couldn't log on and talk to you guys. So I'm excited to be back. It's going to be brief tonight, but I promise that after my boards next week, I'll give a full update of some of the really cool stuff that happened at the conference. So a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to do some presentations at our international conference in Berlin. It was my second time in Berlin, and unfortunately I didn't get to see very much of the city because I was in a lot of meetings, but I was in a lot of cool and very productive meetings, and I'll be talking about some of the exciting stuff that came out of what we had going on in Berlin a few weeks ago. So I'm just going to give you a quick update of some of the things. I'm mostly going to talk about some of the posters that I presented. If you were looking and following me on IG, you saw some pictures of me presenting. So every day, I literally was at the poster session every day. So I had to kind of stand up for 2 hours and tell people about my research. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about it, and hopefully you find it interesting. And then, as I said, next week, when I come back after I take my boards next Thursday, then I'll give you a little bit more of a full update of some of the really cool stuff that we talked about at ECTRIMS. So it's a really big meeting, so there are people from all over the world: Spain, France, Sweden, Switzerland, Africa, the US. So it's really our big science meeting where all of our doctors from all over the world come and present some of the cool latest research related to MS. We talk about some of the new medications. We talk about cutting edge things like stem cell. So there are a lot of different topics going on at the same time. So particularly things that I was interested in this time were kind of lifestyle management things. So there was a lot about what we call modifiable risk factors that we talked about at ECTRIMS. So many times when people have MS, they always ask me, Dr. Williams, what can I do to improve my health with MS? So there's someone that's asking. I do not have multiple sclerosis. I am a physician who specializes in MS, and I've been doing this for the past 10 years, and that is 100% of my practice. I just have a passion for educating people about MS and hope that people can learn something out of the things that I discuss. I also think it's very important for people who live with any kind of condition to understand as much as possible about that condition and to be able and empowered to ask questions. So again, went to our European conference. So a couple things that were really cool that we talked about. We talked a lot about diet. So many people ask about diet in MS. Many people ask if there are certain diets that are specific to MS or that are best for people with MS. And the honest answer is there's still a lot of research to be done, right? So many people are participating in different diets, including gluten-free diets. Some people are doing paleo diets. Some people are doing Mediterranean diets. And so over the past few years, there's been a lot of buzz in the MS community about different types of diet, but also about the effects of foods on the immune system. So there's this new kind of subcategory within the MS community that's emerged. Thank you, Auntie Edwina. There's this new kind of sub group that's emerged that talks a lot about the gut and how the foods that we eat affect MS. There have been some really preliminary studies that suggest if you look at some animal models of MS and you remove all of the what we call flora of the gut, all the bacteria, all the organisms, if you remove all of that stuff, then they don't develop MS, right? But if you replace it, then they can develop MS. So there's a lot of looking at the gut, how it may educate or inform the immune system, and how the foods we eat may cause an inflammatory response. So there was a couple of interesting studies. One of them was done by my good friend, Dr. Ellen Mowry, who is at Johns Hopkins, and they were looking at diet and they were looking at obesity. And their study suggested that people who were obese actually had more loss of volume in their brain, in the gray matter. And that was really interesting because when we think about different parts of the brain and how they affect the disease overall, loss of the gray part of the brain can be associated with long-term disability. So there was some suggestion from that small study that they did that possibly diet and weight can affect long-term disability. And then there was another study that looked at obesity and suggested that there was more progression of disease if people had a larger waist circumference that was associated with obesity. So a lot there about diet, which is very interesting. I think there's a lot more that we need to know, but I think that certainly it's encouraging that there are some things, including exercise, watching your weight, and eating a healthy, balanced diet that you can do as a person living with MS to possibly improve or decrease disability in the long term. I also got a chance to spend some time with a really cool group called MS in the 21st Century. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but it's a steering committee that is composed of physicians who are right now all in Europe, as well as people living with MS. And they talk a lot about how to improve communication between physicians and people living with MS. And they had a really cool poster where they were talking about, or scientific presentation. So when we present our information from our research, we present it at a poster session for those of you who haven't been to a medical conference before. So basically we all stand there next to our posters and people come by and ask questions. So I was standing next to one of the posters for the MS in the 21st Century group. And so they had a really cool study where they basically looked at different things, including side effects of medication, disease-modifying therapies, and they essentially asked the patients what they felt like was discussed at the visit, and then they asked the physicians what they felt was discussed at the visit. And it was very interesting because in some cases they weren't saying the same things. So there were some cases where the physician may have felt that they talked about, for instance, something like progression, but when the patient came out of that visit, they didn't feel like it was discussed. And so that group is really doing some great work looking at how to improve doctor-patient communication, how to ensure that people living with MS get what they need out of doctor's visits, right? So it's not just about us as physicians telling you your MRIs look okay, telling you that, your exam looks okay, but there should be goals when you go to your doctor's visit. And if you look back at some of my other YouTube videos, I talked about how to prepare for your doctor's visit. So it's important that you get something out of it and that you accomplish what you like to accomplish in your doctor's visit, as well as that the physician is able to relay and communicate some information to you. Fortunately, I have been asked to join the MS in the 21st Century Steering Committee. I hope to be doing some work with them at our upcoming Academy of Neurology meeting next year. So very cool stuff there. And now I'll tell you a little bit about some of the research that I presented, which I also thought was pretty cool. So I had 4 posters that I presented or that I was able to author on for this meeting. Several of them involved some of our disease-modifying therapies, and several of them didn't involve any particular therapies at all, but just with some interesting data. So the first poster that I presented was looking at one of our medications, which is Limtrota or alemtuzumab, and it was particularly looking at the effects of alemtuzumab in the people in the original research studies who were of African descent. So if you have seen any work that I've done, I do have an interest in looking at MS in ethnic minority populations. There are some suggestions that the disease may behave a little bit differently in different populations, and so I was asked, fortunately, to participate in this project and present this poster, and hopefully we'll be publishing a paper based on it. And so essentially we found that the medication was effective long-term in people of African descent who were in the original research studies. And one of the other interesting things we found is that the folks who had improvement of their disease seemed to be a higher percentage than what we saw in the original study. So a couple of takeaways. One, that we certainly need people of all different ethnicities involved in our clinical research so that we can make sure that our discoveries are applying to the general population. I think the other thing that's a really important takeaway from that is that now, as we're getting more effective therapies, we are starting to look at measures of improvement. So traditionally, when we think about MS therapy, we've all been talking about how do we slow progression, try to prevent relapses, try to prevent new MRI lesions, how do we try to stabilize, right? But now that we have medications that we know are good at stabilizing, I think that the scientific community and the research community with MS is now looking a little bit more clearly at how do we improve, and looking at measures of improvement and also looking at measures of repair. So I think there's some really cool things that are going to come out of that. And again, when talking about any medication, make sure you talk to your doctor about what treatment is right for you. The other poster that I was able to author with Dr. Bruce Cree, who's really done some groundbreaking work in this field, was looking at one of our newer medications, ocrelizumab, looking at our new medication, ocrelizumab. And so we looked at people of African descent, and that medication also seemed to be effective in that population. So a couple of studies looking at that, and then there was several other posters that I was able to present that looked at people with private insurance and looked at their access to care. And I also did a poster where we looked at people with private insurance. And what we did was we broke people up kind of based on the U.S. data. So this is U.S. data. We broke people up into three groups. So there was a group of people who over a 5-year period had not submitted any claims to their insurance for any disease-modifying therapy. So there were people who were for 5 years not on therapy, okay? The second group was people who were on therapy intermittently over that 5 years, meaning maybe 1 year they were having access to therapy and maybe another year they weren't. And then the third group was people who were on continuous therapy over a 5-year period. So all of these people had private insurance. All of them had access to care potentially, and we looked at people who were not on therapy versus those who were intermittently on therapy versus those who had been on continuous therapy. And there were a couple of measures that we looked at. We looked at how often people were in the hospital. We looked at how quickly people had to order a wheelchair or a walker or a cane. And we also looked at how much they utilize outpatient services such as MRIs. And there were some interesting findings. I think one of the most interesting findings is that we found that about 49% of the people that we had access to who had insurance over 5 years were not on any disease-modifying therapy, okay? So, we're not on continuous disease-modifying therapy. So, over a 5-year period, only 50% were actually continuously on disease-modifying therapy. About 30% were on no therapy during that 5-year period, and then the remainder were on therapy intermittently. So there's a large gap of people who have access to care but are not on disease-modifying therapy. And so certainly that's of concern to us, with the scientific community. I think other interesting things that we found were that the folks who were on continuous therapy had less utilized hospital services. They were less in the ER, If they were in the hospital, they didn't have to stay as longer period of time. And we found that there was a longer time to them ordering wheelchairs versus those who were on intermittent therapy or who were not on therapy at all. So all of that to say, disease-modifying therapy does have some impact on the trajectory of MS. Again, any treatment decision, it's important for you and your physician to sit down and make that treatment decision, right? There are some cases where people are not on therapy for a variety of reasons, okay? But always reassess when you go see your neurologist. Always make sure that you reassess whatever your treatment option is, make sure that it's working for you, make sure that you can tolerate it, and make a decision with you and your healthcare provider, okay? So that was really interesting and fascinating data. We also did a study last year where we looked at folks who were enrolled in Medicaid over a 5-year period, and probably about 70% of that population that we were able to access who were diagnosed with MS were not on disease-modifying therapy. So, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of education to be done, you know, but again, my goal is always to empower and advocate you all, you know, to advocate for yourselves. So one other interesting study that I'll just briefly mention was looking at vitamin D. So there's always a lot of buzz about vitamin D in the MS community. How much vitamin D should I be taking? You know, how does vitamin D affect MS? I think there's a lot that we still don't know. But this particular study looked at risk of disability progression. And there was some suggestion that it looked at risk of disability progression was one study, but there was another study that looked at risk of developing MS. So that study was done in a Swiss population, and in some other countries there are actually registries where people who are diagnosed with MS are actually enrolled in a registry, so they have an accurate count of how many people in their country or in their region have that disease. That's not the case here in the United States where I live, but certainly there are large registries in other countries where we have accurate numbers, and so there are different studies that can be done. So this study was a Swedish study, and they looked at surprisingly 666 samples. So they looked at people who had MS and they looked at people who did not have MS, and they looked at blood samples at different time points and then tried to compare vitamin D levels for those that went on to develop MS versus those that didn't. And this is the fourth study that's attempted to look at vitamin D and blood samples in this way. And so what they found was that there was suggestion that the folks with the highest vitamin D levels had less risk of developing MS. And this was more apparent for the younger age groups, like 0 to 19, but these results were not statistically significant. So again, there's a lot of work that needs to be done with vitamin D. Generally, I recommend if your vitamin D is low, that we replace it. You know, again, a decision you sit and talk to your doctor about, look at your numbers, decide if you need to be on replacement and what replacement you need to be on. So really cool stuff that we talked about. There also was a lot of talk about pregnancy. It seems like the percentage of women with MS who are pregnant is increasing, so more women with MS are having babies. And then there also was a small study that looked at the effects of disease-modifying therapy or initiating therapy on women's ability to have children. And so, you know, it basically was asking the question for women who, let's say, get diagnosed with MS, they go to the doctor, they may be planning to have a family in the near future after they're diagnosed. Should they go on disease-modifying therapy, and would that affect their ability to have babies or the outcomes of the babies? And what they found was that for the people that did go ahead and start therapy, did not seem to have effect overall on them being able to have kids or successfully have kids, as long as there were no other barriers to that. Now, they didn't talk specifically about people staying on therapy during pregnancy, and they didn't talk necessarily about when people stopped therapy before they became pregnant, because for the most part, we still don't recommend that people stay on disease-modifying therapy during pregnancy. But it seemed that if they started it maybe for 6 months or whatever and then stopped it before they tried to get pregnant, it didn't affect their ability to become pregnant. So a lot of really, really cool stuff. I will promise to give you guys another better update about some of our disease-modifying therapies and some of the interesting findings with some of the new drugs that are coming down the pipeline. pipeline when I follow up with my live stream next week. But again, the things that we talked about today are a couple of studies that I presented, one of which talked about one of our medications, alemtuzumab, that had a very good effect on people of African descent. Also talked about ocrelizumab and the effects that seemed to be equally effective in people who were of African descent as well. Those are two of my posters. My other two posters looked at folks in the U.S. who have private insurance and access to care, and we found that only about 50% of patients enrolled in private insurance here in the U.S. who have access to disease-modifying therapies, only about half of them were actually on and filing claims for disease-modifying therapies. So we know that the medications, hi Khadijah, you did make it, my cousin. So we did see that a lot of folks, even though they have access to care, for some reason are not on disease-modifying therapies. And we do know that overall they do make a difference in the course of disease and in the disability progression that we see with multiple sclerosis. So there's a lot of work to be done. As I said, there's so many groups that are doing a lot of great work towards improving quality of life for people living with MS. One of them I talked about was the MS in the 21st Century Steering Committee. If you have a chance to look up the website, please do so. They're doing some really great stuff. They even have some tools that you can use when you go to the doctor to kind of write out your symptoms and make sure that you're addressing your top issues, and you can visit their website. I think you would just Google it. I don't know the website off the top of my head. And then also I got to meet with some of my good friends from the Accelerated Cure Project and I Conquer MS, which is an MS registry for people who are living with MS that's focused on research, but it's primarily run by people who have MS, and making sure that when research is done, the questions that people who live with MS want to be answered are answered. So they also have a really cool, group that's doing some amazing stuff, and we've got some collaborations with them. And I actually was able to attend one of their leadership summits this year, and really enjoyed hearing the perspectives of people who live with MS from all walks of life about things that are important to them. So again, it's important to know that you have a voice. It's okay to have objectives when you go to your doctor's visit, and it's okay to get information and to learn and to take that information back to your doctor to improve your quality of life. So with that being said, I am Dr. Mitzi Joy. I am your board certified neurologist and multiple sclerosis specialist. My mission is to engage, educate, and empower people living with MS to become an active part of their healthcare team, and to encourage people to participate in clinical research. So I think I had a few questions. Let me see if I go back. I think I had a few questions I might try to answer since I have a few minutes before I have to get back to my studying. My auntie said that I'll do well on my boards. Thank you, Auntie Weena. Someone asked, how did I become interested in MS? Which is a question that I frequently get. So I am a people person, if you did not surmise or get that from me. So I'm a people person. I am a person that sometimes goes into a situation and it just feels like home. I don't know how else to put it, but I had the opportunity to work with my mentor, Dr. Mary Hughes, who is an amazing neurologist and MS specialist, taught me everything I know. And so I had the opportunity to do a rotation with her at the MS clinic when I was doing residency at the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, Georgia. And she had been at that MS center, started it from scratch, had been there for about 10 years. And when I went into the clinic, I just loved the people. I loved the challenge that everybody was different. And sometimes in the MS community, we say, if you've seen one patient with MS, you've seen one patient with MS, because everybody's so different. So I like the challenge. I love the relationship with people. I love that I get to go on this journey with them and kind of walk with them and their families. And subsequently, after I decided to become an MS specialist, I had a family member that was diagnosed with MS, who is young, kind of close to my age. I guess I consider myself young. I won't tell you my age. But I had a family member that was diagnosed. And so it really kind of gave me a passion to just really really do the best that I can to help. And once I got into the field, I became very passionate about education, because I became really disheartened that I would see people who had had MS for years, you know, when we would try to talk about, well, what is it? Or, you know, the understanding was not what I felt it should be, okay? And I feel like my goal is to try to make sure that people understand, to the best of their ability, you know, the plan that we have, why we're doing what we're doing, what is this disease that you have, and how do we try to fight this thing together, you know, and how do you play a part in fighting and combating MS? Because I feel that medicine plays a part, but you as a person always play a part, okay? And no medicine will take away the part that we play. So there's always a part that we can play in improving our health and empowering ourselves to do better with any condition. So that's how I became interested in MS. Okay. And somebody else put a question about finding a neurologist. You know, so there are some resources through the National MS Society or MS Societies, depending on where you live. And if you go to your local MS Society page, they often will have a list of neurologists who specialize or who see a lot of MS that are within your area. So unfortunately, there are some areas of the country and some areas of the world where there aren't as many MS specialists, but certainly they can often list those that will be in your vicinity or the closest to you who specialize in MS. So I encourage everybody to reach out to their local MS societies, you know, to see who's closest to them, who may specialize or see MS patients. All right, and I see a lot of people saying hello, and I see someone saying, I'm an amazing doctor. Thank you so much. Anyway, all right, guys, well, I have got to get back to studying, and I've got 2 little munchkins that need some bedtime stories, and so I'm going to be up late with some coffee and doing some questions. So I hope that you all have an amazing evening. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Please feel free to follow me on Facebook if you're on this page. Hopefully you're following me. Also follow me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Dr. Mitzi Joy MD, DrMitziJoimd. Also, I've got some really cool things coming up. I'm going to be getting my website up and running while I have more information about some of the cool stuff that I'm doing. Also, I'm in the process of writing a book, so be on the lookout for that early next year. And I've also got some employment changes coming up, so you might see Dr. Mitzi with a different hat on in a couple of months. So please stay tuned. And please tell your friends about it. Please feel free to share my video. Also, you can follow my YouTube page. I hope that you all get something out of it. And if there are topics that you want to hear about, just kind of post in the comments and I will try to catch them at some point. So everyone have an amazing evening. Happy Thursday. All right. And I will see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. I might be a little sleepy after my boards, but I'm sure I will be excited to be doing something else besides studying. All right. Have a great night, guys.